Mr. Senate President, my colleagues covered reasons why they oppose this budget, and I share their concerns. I won't repeat much of what they have said. I will focus my comments on how the process leading up to this budget, as well as the budget itself, grossly undermines two related guiding principles that are important to every democracy. First, the right of the public to be involved and heard by the government in the course of its affairs. Second, having a full legislature, not the executive or small subset of the legislature, appropriate the public's money to prevent a single executive or a small group of people from getting an unhealthy amount of power. As for the right of the public to be involved and heard, there's been a lot of attention in the last few days about budget bills being added to committee agendas with no meaningful public notice. Bills were considered that no members of the public could see. Not all legislators had copies of bills when the votes were taken. Those things were awful for transparency. Some people have been quoted in the newspapers as saying this year has been no worse than past years. I would respectfully but strongly disagree. I think this year, in the last few weeks in particular, we jumped the shark. Aside from process issues, there are substantial provisions in this budget that make transparency even worse. It appropriates about 20% of almost $6.5 billion federal block grant for specific purposes, but it leaves $5 billion to the governor to appropriate. It similarly gives $1.2 billion to the governor to appropriate for any capital projects. Both of these funds will have a token joint budget oversight role. But these massive funds that the governor is allowed to largely control fly in the face of 250 years of public budgeting democracies. Traditionally, budget systems begin with a governor or executive proposing a spending plan. Then the plan is vetted in public. Ultimately, the legislature appropriates funds with changes. It encourages planning, public participation, and improvements. When all this is done, the governor or executive executes the appropriation. This budget creates these two massive funds that short-circuit the traditional system. No detailed plan will come to the full legislature for review. There won't be meaningful public scrutiny or hearings before the obscure joint JBOC. Obviously, transparency and public involvement will suffer. Look what happened when the governor was allowed to appropriate CARES money. What happened? Fully 1/4 of the money was wasted on employee salaries in violation of one of the few federal prohibitions on fund use. $25 million went to pay interest or unnecessary debt. We uncovered gross examples of waste in grant programs at DCA. Money meant to help the suffering people was squandered. Everyone in this chamber was outraged by the governor not making enough funds available in a timely way for businesses and schools. With the CARES money, an argument could at least be made that delegating power to the governor to act quickly was appropriate. That money was made available at the worst point in a global pandemic, and the federal law required it all to be spent in 9 months. But now, the pandemic is in full retreat. The federal law creating this grant gives a 4-year window for the money to be spent. This legislature can act pretty quickly when it wants to, but we're supposed to believe the legislature can't act quickly enough, so we need to punt decisions that belong to this body to the governor. It's nonsense. Finally, my last issue with the public being pushed aside in this budget concerns almost 200 appropriations for parochial items of concern which have never been explained, much less justified as being priorities for funding. This obscene level of pork has not existed since the last years of the McGreevey administration. Back then, when there was this kind of unexplained pork, 2 senators were hauled off to jail in handcuffs for giving money to employees for low or no-show jobs. Senator Cody responded and implemented a rule that every time line item added to the budget needs to be explained in a resolution and be released to the public. These resolutions are under lock and key and are not being made public in violation of the rule. Since no one in the public or in this body, except a few people, have access to these resolutions, no one has any idea what these line items will pay for and who asked for them. Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, I would like to ask the sponsor of this bill a few questions about the hundreds of line items in this bill, the only explanation for which are under lock and key. Will the sponsor yield for a few questions?
Senator Sarlo, the senator has a couple of questions.
Will you commit to immediately releasing the resolutions so the public can vet them? And will you also commit to sharing them with the governor so he can carefully review the resolutions and veto the ones that are defensible?
Senator, I control the resolutions and I will release them.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Senate President. My next question is whether you or someone in this chamber can explain two of the line items of this budget. What are they actually paying for, and why are they a priority to be included in this budget? The ones I'd like to better understand are municipal fish kill cleanup support for $72,000 and North Bergen School District property acquisition for $10 million. The first one's a small amount, but smells a little fishy to me. The second one gives about twice as much money to North Bergen schools for a pet project, and so almost twice the spending cut to Old Bridge schools. I want to know why this port is more important than funding for a middle-class school district.
Senator.
Thank you, Senator Thompson. Senator Thompson, there's a significant amount of various spending priorities. Sometimes one or two of them will stand out, but there's many that are within the departments, and DEP and DOE and DOT. There's many other projects similar to this that are funded as part of the introduced budget. So to get into answering questions on a specific line item that the administration feels is a priority, I mean, I think I could sit with you anytime and we could walk through and have conversations on, but that specific project, I'm not sure why that was a priority of the administration, but clearly it was added to the budget.
To be honest, Senator, I'm tempted to ask you to explain every line item added to this budget.
We're not doing
that wasn't
that,
discussed before the budget committees, and there are a lot of them. Okay. I won't monopolize your time, but I hope some others won't shy away from asking you to explain a few other items that appeared in the budget over the last few days and that might look questionable to them.
And Senator Thompson, you know, I'll spend as much time with you, and we could go line item by line item, and we're going to need a lot of cigarettes and a lot of scotch, but we can get through it.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Senator Sarlo.
One last item I'd like to mention is that, of course, in the past year, the governor went to the state Supreme Court to request permission to borrow almost $10 billion because of projected budget shortfalls. And, in fact, in doing so, he said to the Supreme Court and to the public that in the event the revenues exceed what we're projecting and we have the money, we will pay off these bonds. And he went out to bond for $4.3 billion. Well, it developed that the money was available, but unfortunately, the Treasury sold the bonds as non-callable. Therefore, he could not pay them off. But in light of his pledge, we do have lots of bonds out there, outstanding, and I note that the budget does call for using $2.5 billion to retire those. I would suggest that since, again, we have more money than we really need, $4.3 billion be used to pay out bonding. It may not be the same bonds, but it will save the interest on other bonds and so on. So instead of because the other $1.8 billion he borrowed is essentially going into what is almost a $10 billion surplus while we continue paying interest on bonds out there. So I would recommend that the amendments be made in order that he can pay $4.3 billion worth of bonds out there, whatever bonds they are, to save the interest rather than continue to pay interest on these bonds and every other one. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator.